I want to start with where you started Rhetorical Occasions, which was with the Sokal Hoax.
Oh, okay.
Which you say, and I think this strikes some people as counterintuitive, is sort of one of the most powerfully important moments in recent intellectual history. So I wonder if you could start off by telling us what you thought was so important about the Sokal. Just to, okay, this is when in 1996 a physicist named Alan Sokal submits an essay to the journal Social Text, and it's called Towards a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity, right? Yeah.
Right.
And then in the essay he recapitulates some of the most ridiculous things that he can find in science studies. And then he sort of says, and these ideas have altered my view of physics. Right. And in the course of doing so, he makes sure to say all kinds of things that any junior physicist would know would bunk, right? So,
any physics major, unfortunately.
Right. Yeah. And then he publishes an essay in lingua franca saying, gotcha. Okay. Why is this so important?
Why is this so important? I wouldn't have thought it was so important. At the time, I thought it was just an egg in the face of a couple of my friends who were snookered by an essay they should have sent to a physicist. End of story. But you wander off my end of the campus where still people regard Sokal as just either a person of bad faith or a buffoon for doing this. And I can't tell you the number of times either people in the social sciences or the sciences or interested bystanders basically have written off whatever they wanted to write off anyway, whether it's postmodernism or cultural studies or deconstruction or God knows what. After all, Sokal proved that all that was bullshit. And, fine. So if he gave certain people an excuse not to read stuff they knew anything about or were interested in anyway, but I think it went a little deeper than that. In the first two essays, really, in Rhetorical Occasions, but mostly in the first one, I try to go back and make the case that Sokal's parody essay, the hoax essay, was much weirder than people realize. That, in fact, its targets are fairly diffuse, and one of the targets includes popular science writing by scientists. So there's a passage in that essay that I thought was, pure bunk about wormholes in space where people can go back and meet their earlier selves. And I was writing to Sokal and said, what exactly is that a parody of? He says, no, that's not a parody. That's one of the things that's one of the things that Bohr suggested as a result of blah, blah, blah. And some of his sallies on that score, I think, really missed their targets. For example, there's a moment which I believe it's Bohr, but it could be Heisenberg, one of the two weird boys of quantum theory, suggesting that there really are social implications of the uncertainty principle. And if this is the case in mere physics, the most basic elements of matter, surely it has ramifications for the way we think about gender relations. That isn't some besotted women's studies / science studies person writing loose rigere inspired meditations on gravity as a sexist construct. That's Bohr himself. So I think the essay itself is way, like I said, way more diffuse than people understand it to be. Also, I think way more interesting. I don't admire it in every single detail, but I do think it's worth going back and actually reading, even 12 years later. But that's not the way it was picked up. The way it was picked up was, scientist debunks social text. Social text, leading journal of cultural studies. See, these people wouldn't even know bunk and hokum when they saw it. And what made the episode really newsworthy for me was that the early response by the editors, and it was mainly Andrew Ross, that they turned and fired on Sokal, where clearly they had media advisors. Media advisors, no, your play is here. Boy's my face red. We took this guy at his word. We didn't, as Bruce Robin said this much later, 7 months later, like in an interview with a Rutgers University newsletter. That's where I found this thing. He said, look, we're not physicists. We assumed that he was dealing with this in good faith. We just thought it was so extraordinary that a physicist would say these things that we thought it was publishable. And if you're on that terrain, suddenly on very different terrain, because everyone, there is a sort of popular understanding, right out to Science Times on Tuesday or whatever. It's part of the job of physicists to say completely bizarre, counterintuitive things. You think it's just in the job description. And so if they come out and say, that there's a transformative hermeneutics of quantum gravity, I'll bet you any money, even at this late date, that half the people who looked at that sneered at the idea of transformative hermeneutics half of them sneer at the idea of quantum gravity. Quantum gravity is real. Quantum gravity is a question of how to reconcile theory of gravitation with general relativity, with quantum mechanics. It's not me. I think it was John Brinkman had the best take on this. I cited somewhere in the book that the original essay was quite interesting, and certainly the fact that it got published suggests something about coterie culture in the humanities. I think that's quite true. But Brinkman was saying the initial essay is a fairly interesting kind of performance. Sokal's follow-ups on it, what he thought he did with it, are significantly less interesting than that. Nevertheless, it proved a pretty handy way of delegitimating a whole mess of work in cultural studies and the humanities for no good reason, but I think it's worth revisiting. The Sokal Hoax does kind of, I don't know, woozy relativism with regard to the sciences. It's so taken for granted in some quarters that you can get away with almost anything. Which brings me to the last thing. The reverberations of the Sokal Hoax for science studies are still being felt, and I wouldn't have thought so, but for the fact that Steve Fuller showed up in my state in Dover, PA, to testify in favor of intelligent design. As far as I'm concerned, that's so much more damning than anything Sokal said. Now, Steve Fuller happens to have had an essay in that same issue with the Sokal essay, and Steve Fuller is a very, very strange and interesting fellow. He has managed to convince himself that the only reason ID intelligent design isn't being given a fair hearing in biology departments is that basically people are working with the Kuhnian paradigm of Darwinian evolution, and they're just shutting everything else out. So he's making this sort of sociology of science claim for intelligent design. As far as I'm concerned, that is such good red meat for people like Norman Levitt and Paul Gross. Now, basically, they should be writing me again saying, "Gotcha again," because we told you this would happen.